morning. Once again, it's good to see everybody here. Appreciate your presence here, whether it's physically in person or online. We appreciate you tuning in. We're going to be picking up our study in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 37. As you might remember last week, we didn't cover the whole chapter of 23 for a reason. We stopped short of verse 37. And the reason for that is that these verses set up and define what Christ is going to be talking about in chapter 24. And so it's very much connected to chapter 24. If you remember last week, Christ came and was speaking against the scribes, the Pharisees, and whom he called the hypocrites. And he was speaking out against them. Here, of course, Matthew presenting Christ as a king, and he's coming here towards the end of his ministry with a sword drawn. Not so much a physical sword, but the sword of his mouth. The words that he spoke cut deep, sharper than any two-edged sword, and cut to the piercing of the heart of those religious leaders who were just putting on an outward show, but weren't really wholeheartedly devoted to God as they professed. And so he pronounced woes against them, and woes to the extent to where when people heard it, perhaps they said, whoa, this is something that the Lord is giving that is very stern, and he's speaking to them in a way that perhaps no one had ever spoken to them before. And so the king is pronouncing judgment against those who were rejecting him. It ended there, at least last week we ended with verse 34, where he says, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." That's a very important phrase, this generation. There was this pronouncement of judgment against them, and it was one that generation would experience. That generation. If you do a word study on that, whenever Jesus is talking about this generation, it's always speaking about the generation in which he was living. A 40-year, usually around a 40-year gap there, but from generation to generation. And Jesus is saying judgment will come upon this generation. We'll see that phrase pop up again in chapter 24. So just put that in your mental Rolodex and leave it ready to bring up again as we get into chapter 24. But he's pronouncing judgment against them. And then in verse 37, he laments over Jerusalem. He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." And that had been true not only in the present state or time where Jesus is, but all the way back to their history. Whenever God would send prophets and servants and different people to try to correct their waywardness, they usually responded with stones or some type of persecution against those who were sent to them. And that was going to be true in this generation that Jesus was in. It says, "How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." I wanted to bring you under the shadow of my wings, under the shadow of the Most High. And I wanted to bring you under my protection, where there is protection, where there is sustenance, where there is a deep, abiding relationship. This is what God wanted from Israel. He wanted to be able to spread his wings over them and to have that type of relationship. But they were not willing. Every time he would reach out his wings, every time he would send out his prophets, his servants, they were unwilling. They wanted to go after their own way. They wanted to go after the way of the nations, serve other idols, do other things, and they pushed away God's call to them. So, verse 38, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be uninhabitable. Here Jesus is speaking from the temple, because when we get into chapter 24, it says Jesus came out from the temple there in verse 1. So he's in the temple saying, your house, so he's speaking about the temple, will be made desolate. That was going to be the judgment that would be pronounced upon them for continuously rejecting those sent to them, but of course ultimately by rejecting the very Messiah that was sent to them, the king that they should have embraced, they pushed away, and judgment was coming. Verse 39, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now that is a loaded verse. And there has been a lot of scholarly work done, either directly towards this verse or that had included this verse. What does it mean that they'll no longer see him until they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord? Well, if you remember in the triumphal entry that we talked about before, in chapter 21, that's what Jesus' disciples were saying, really. When he came in on the donkey and he was coming into Jerusalem, what were they saying? Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But not everyone was convinced, and especially the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes. That became very evident in the way that they responded to the crowd ushering Jesus in this way. But he said that there would come a time when they would say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There would be a time when they would join in with Jesus' disciples and say that very thing. So what does he mean by that? What is implied by that? Well, I think if we just take it for what it means, if we just take it in its natural understanding, it means that there will come a time when they will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. If you cross-reference Romans chapter 11 speaks about a time when the Jewish people will come to accept the Messiah, and they will receive the mercy of God on them. If you go to verse 25 of Romans 11, and yes, this is like diving right into the middle of a conversation, and there's a whole lot of context around these verses, but we don't have time to do a study on Romans so that we can fully understand these verses. But I do want to kind of zero in on them because they give a little snippet of God's plan for humanity and all, but also the Gentiles and the Jews. This is what he says. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. So in the present, remember, the book of Romans was written in the 1st century, before the destruction of Jerusalem. And Paul here is saying that a partial hardening has happened to the Jewish nation at that time, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. Now Luke chapter 21 uses that same phrase, the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And he says that Jerusalem would be destroyed and it would be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So there's a time frame that's being given here. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come, Israel was going to be hardened against the gospel, hardened against Christ. It was going to be a partial hardening. Some of them, there was a little small remnant that were coming to Christ. Paul would have been one of those included in that. It was partial, but then there's going to come a time when the nation would experience salvation, not that every single one would, but as a people they would accept it. Because it goes on to say in verse 26, and so all Israel will be saved. So it won't be the partial hardening would be taken away, and all Israel will be saved. Just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Talking about them as a people. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. At that time, they were enemies. They were persecuting Christians. They didn't like the fact that they were proclaiming Jesus Christ as the Messiah. But from the standpoint of God's choice, he says they are beloved for the sake of the Father. So they were still beloved by the Father, or beloved by God, because of the sake of the patriarchs and the fathers and the covenants and the promises that God had made to them. He says in verse 29, for the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. So he wasn't just going to forget all those promises and covenants to the fathers. He would be faithful to them by one day showing mercy upon the Jewish people. He says in verse 30, for just as you were once obedient to God, you Gentiles, you were once disobedient. Romans chapter 1, this downward spiral of immorality and rejecting God, worshiping the created instead of the Creator. Just as you've been disobedient but now have found mercy because of their disobedience brought about the crucifixion of Christ. It brought about the expanse of the gospel. It wasn't until persecution hit Jerusalem that the message went out, right? So the disobedience of the Jews brought mercy to the Gentiles. In verse 31, he says, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may be shown mercy. So as God shows his mercy, his loving kindness to the Gentiles, that would be instrumental in also making a way for the Jewish people to experience that as well. He says, they also may now be shown mercy. Verse 32, for God has shut up all in disobedience so that he may show mercy on all. So this whole process of the Jews first being hardened, disobedient, which would be instrumental in bringing about the salvation of all men and the expanse of the gospel. Well, the Gentiles would receive that readily. They would be shown mercy. Through their being shown mercy, the Jews would be provoked to jealousy, and then they too would receive mercy, so that God can show mercy on everybody. And then Paul concludes, oh, the depths and the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Just showing how much God wants to disperse his mercy on everyone. So that's a long explanation of what he's talking about here in Matthew 23 in the very last verse, where he says, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There's going to come a time when they will join with those in the triumphal entry who were saying, Hosanna, Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then that would be the time when they would see him again. All right, so that concludes, of course, chapter 23, but it doesn't necessarily conclude the topic that we're dealing with here, because the disciples want to know the rest of the story, and they'll get it in chapter 24. In chapter 24, it says, Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. So they're coming out of the temple, the disciples are with him, and they're looking at the temple and how beautiful it was. Herod the Great was really big into architecture. And that was one of the ways that he kept in good with the Jews. He would adorn the temple and make it really, really beautiful. The disciples are impressed by this, and they're pointing out to Jesus, wow, look how wonderful this beautiful temple is. Look at all these wonderful buildings that are connected to the temple, how great they are. Well, listen to how Jesus responds. Does Jesus say, oh yeah, you're right, this is very impressive? No, he doesn't. In verse 2 it says, and he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. So he's saying, okay, yeah, you're impressed with this physical temple that is here before you. You're impressed at how beautiful it is. But this physical temple will be destroyed and torn down. And there was going to be another temple that would replace it that would be eternal. And we'll study that more as we go through the New Testament. But don't be so impressed with this temporary temple. Now, there's some application here for us as well, in that sometimes we can get caught up in the things of this world. Maybe we look at technology, and maybe if the Lord was here, we might say, Lord, look how technologically advanced we have become since you came around, and look how wonderful it is that we can have basically a computer in the palm of our hand, and all these wonderful medical advances and all these things that we have had. I believe Jesus would probably tell us the same things. Are you impressed by all these things? One day, all these things are going to be destroyed. Not one stone will be left upon another in a figurative sense. Oftentimes, we do get caught up in what's new, what's fancy, what's beautiful, what's great, and all these different things. But we just got to remember, there's going to come a time when all these things won't be anymore. In Hebrews chapter 1, the Hebrew writer compares the temporary nature of this creation to the eternality of Jesus Christ in verse 10, where he says, and you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. And wonderful and great is the creation. I love being out in nature and being in God's creation. But listen to what he says as he continues in verse 11. They will perish, but you remain. And they will all become old like a garment. And like a mantle you will roll them up. And like a garment they will also be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. So oftentimes we get caught up in the things of this world. I got a brand new watch, or I got a brand new car, or I got, this new gadget or gizmo. And we get so caught up in all these material things that we have, we just got to keep it in perspective. One day, all these things will be destroyed. But the Lord remains forever. So let's latch on to God, who is eternal, and not get so caught up in these temporary things. Nothing wrong with having certain things, so long as we're not becoming enamored by them, and maybe even in our hearts, in a sense, worship them, in that they take the place of God in our lives. But anyways, this is what the disciples are doing. Wow, look at this wonderful temple. And Jesus is saying, nah, it's not even going to be here. In just a few short years, it will be torn down. And that's exactly what happened. When Titus came with the Roman army, and they laid siege on Jerusalem and then made their way into the temple, the soldiers got kind of carried away, and they inadvertently caught the temple on fire. And there became such an immense heat in the temple that it melted all the gold on the temple, and that gold seeped in through the cracks in the stones. So what the Roman soldiers did then is, to get to that gold, they overturned every stone to get the gold out from in between the stones. And so this prophecy was literally fulfilled. Every stone was taken down. Not one stone was left upon another. The temple was completely destroyed. So, of course, as would be expected, the disciples want to hear more. In verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the Mount of Olives was east of the city. While they were sitting there, they would have been able to look out and see the temple. The temple, it was so wonderfully adorned, it would shine in the sunlight. It was very visible from the Mount of Olives. But nonetheless, that's where they're sitting. And the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So when is this going to happen? And, every once in a while when you're reading the Gospels, people ask questions that you would like to ask. If Jesus were with you, like, Lord, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Or, Lord, teach me how to pray. And here, Lord, when will these things take place? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? These are questions that we would perhaps want to know too if Jesus were sitting right next to us. Well, Jesus is going to answer their question. And he's going to give them a lot more than just answering the question, as we'll see as we continue on. But they're basically wanting to know two things. The time and the sign. That's the two things basically they're asking. The time and the sign. When's it going to happen? What's going to be the time of it? And what's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? But it's interesting how Jesus responds. He doesn't say, okay, this is the time. It's going to happen at this time, and this is going to be the sign, and boom, that's it. That's the answer. Notice what he says first in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Here we get a little bit of the heart of Jesus. I don't know that it was really priority to Christ to give them a calendar with the events and when they're going to take place, and a timeline for them to do it, or to see these things happen. He does do that, but it seems like his priority is more along the lines of, don't be misled, and don't go after false Christ. Don't be misled and go and leave me for something else. That seems to be his priority. And oftentimes we want to get caught up in prophecy and end times and all those things, and those are wonderful studies. As a matter of fact, I have an ongoing study that I do whenever I'm not preparing for a sermon or preparing for something else. I'm usually studying the end times because it's just fascinating to me. But we can make that so much of a focus that we forget the priority of, hey, I need to cling to Christ and not be drawn away from Christ, no matter what happens. And that's where Christ puts the priority. He's going to come back to it later on in the chapter, after he talks about the tribulation. He says, then if anyone says to you, behold, here's the Christ, this is verse 23, or there he is, don't believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, mislead, if possible, even the elect. If they tell you, hey, he's out in the wilderness, don't go after him. If they say he's in the inner room, don't believe them. He really wants them to cling to him and not to get distracted by these other things. So I guess I say all this to say that, we can get into a lot of the different views. This Matthew 24 is a highly debated chapter. Just go online and look up on YouTube or somewhere, and you'll find debate after debate in connection to Matthew 24. There are the preterists who believe that all of Matthew 24 was fulfilled in the first century. There's the futurists who believe that all of it is still to come in the future. And then there's those who are in between who take some of it to be fulfilled in the first century and some to be fulfilled later on. And you should see the battles that take place between these different groups, and even people pronouncing, condemnation on each other and saying you're wrong and this and that because you take this standpoint and that's the wrong standpoint. I take this standpoint. Let's keep it all in perspective. Christ's main concern was that we cling to him. No matter what happens, that we have Christ. Don't be led astray. That would be important spiritually, obviously, for them not to be led to another, to follow after another Christ, or one who is proclaiming to be Christ. But physically it was important for them too, because in AD 70, when the destruction of Jerusalem took place, there were people who were proclaiming to be the Christ, and they were saying, no, destruction is not coming. We can get out of this mess. We can save ourselves. And it would have been very important for the disciples of Jesus not to believe those people, just for the sake that they would take the advice of Christ and get out of there and not have a false hope and be destroyed with the ones that the Lord was bringing judgment against. There's a lot going on here, but his main concern seems to be, hey, don't get led astray. Don't follow after someone else who claims to be me. He says in verse 6, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. The way I take these verses, and it's a little difficult to interpret because you see all these events take place before the destruction of Jerusalem. There were wars that were going on. There were earthquakes that happened within the Roman Empire. There was definitely persecution going on in the church. But we've also seen those things since the destruction of Jerusalem as well. And so it can sometimes be difficult to navigate which he is speaking about, which age is he mentioning. I take this as kind of like an overview that Jesus is giving before he gets into the details. So he's given like a panoramic view of world events. He's saying all of these things are going to take place before the end. There is going to be persecution. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to endure all types of hardships. Matter of fact, Luke 21, if you cross-reference it, puts that before the earthquakes and the famines and the pestilence. Whenever you see, let's make this point real quick. Whenever you see then in Matthew 24, it can be misleading because you think this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. But the original word in the Greek just means at that time. So then, at that time, this will take place. So Luke puts the tribulation of the saints before the earthquakes and the famines and the things. Matthew says then, he just means that at that time. So in that time frame, these are the things that are going to take place. Luke gives us more information, but he says, there's going to be persecution, there's going to be famines, there's going to be wars, and this is the beginning of the birth pains. Don't be afraid. This is all orchestrated by God. This is the way that he's going to bring about the end. And so he's given us kind of like a panoramic view before he gets into the details. In verse 15, he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So he's zeroing us in on something there. In verse 16, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Moreover, or whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. So he says, whenever you see the abomination of desolation. Now, what is the abomination of desolation? Well, Daniel talked about an abomination of desolation that would occur pretty soon, not real soon after, but a few hundred years after he wrote it, which talked about Epiphanes, who came in and actually offered up pigs on the altar and basically desecrated the temple. This was before, of course, the New Testament, but after the Old Testament. And there was this abomination, desolation, that Daniel prophesied about, but Christ is using that imagery to then bring it into their own time to say something similar like that is going to happen. Something similar to that is going to happen. So when would that take place? Well, we do know that Titus and his army would come in and they would set fire to the temple. But by then, one might think, well, that's too late. Once Titus is in, once the city's been overtaken, that's kind of late to try to flee then. It's already been overtaken. That's where Luke chapter 21 can help us out. Because he says in verse 20, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. So Luke is saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out. When you see the Roman army coming, it's time to get out. And that is the sign that the abomination of desolation is about to take place. And so you need to escape at that point. And so this is what Jesus is teaching them. When you see these things start to transpire, when you see the Roman armies coming up against Jerusalem, get out. It's much like, remember Lot and Sodom? Get out. The angels had to grab him by the hand and pull him out because fire and brimstone was coming. Don't mess around. Even Lot's wife was told, don't even look back. Just keep going. And this is similar to what Jesus is telling them. Don't go back for your cloak. Don't go back into your house if you're on the housetop. Just get out of there. And he says, we read in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. This tribulation, what is the tribulation talking about? Well, there's a lot, again, this is another huge topic, especially when you get into the book of Revelations, and there's a lot of views and points made about the tribulation. I think in this particular context, the tribulation is the tribulation that the Jewish nation was going to undergo. And it would begin with the destruction of Jerusalem. It would begin with the Roman army coming in, it being destroyed. The siege was a horrible thing that took place. The army surrounded Jerusalem. The people were starving to death. It was just a horrible situation. If you ever go in and read the history of it, it was a very, definitely very perilous times that they underwent. But I believe that was just the starting point, and then that would continue on, even like the Holocaust, like we experienced just the past century. Horrible things that have happened. And the Jewish people, every time, in every case in between there, have been hated, they've been persecuted, they've been scattered into the different nations. They've just been in a state of tribulation. Luke, in Luke chapter 21, shows this to be more of a lengthy time frame than just the destruction of Jerusalem being the tribulation. You get the idea that this is extended over a period of time. He says, after talking about woe to those, verse 23, those who are pregnant and for those who are nursing babies in those times, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword. That would happen with the Roman government coming in. And then they would be led captive into all nations, showing a period of time that's taking place. And Jerusalem would be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, which would happen at the destruction of Jerusalem, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So showing a passing of time. And there he says not the time singular of the Gentiles is fulfilled, but the times, showing a progression of time. There would be different times. If you go back to the original language, it means different. That word time means like an appointed, like a sliver of a particular section of time. And there would be several seasons or times of the Gentiles, and when all that was fulfilled, then that would be the end of the tribulation that they were under. And so a lengthy tribulation brought upon the Jewish nation. And so he says in verse 22, going back to Matthew 24, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days would be cut short. So it's not going to be an ongoing thing to where it's going to last forever until just the Jewish nation is obliterated and doesn't exist anymore. He was going to cut it short before that took place for the sake of the elect being God's chosen people through the covenants. It says in verse 23, then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. There's Jesus' concern once again that people are going to be misled by these false messiahs. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. And there is a group of people who claim to be Christian who have that very belief. They believe that Jesus is in an inner room somewhere and is feeding them information, and that's what they follow. He's saying, don't listen to that. Don't believe them if they say he's in the wilderness or in the inner room. He says in verse 27, why? For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. When Jesus comes again, you're going to know it. It's not going to be, oh, he's out there in the wilderness, or he's in some inner room, or he's over here, over there. You're going to see it. It's like when lightning strikes, everybody sees it. They see the light that comes from the lightning. That's how the coming of the Son of Man will be. And he says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. In other words, wherever you see the evidence, if you see vultures, when you're driving down the highway and you see a bunch of vultures, that's a sign that there's a corpse there. And Jesus coming again would be a sign that these things are taking place. Verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, so after this lengthy period of tribulation on the Jewish nation, in those days the sun will be darkened. Or, I'm sorry, immediately after, let's see, I think I want to make a point on that. In Luke 21, okay, so after he says, in Luke 21, after he says in verse 24 that the city, Jerusalem, would be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, he immediately then goes into, there will be signs in sun and moon and stars and on the earth, dismay among nations, and perpetually at the roaring of the sea and of the waves. So there in Luke chapter 21, he places those things happening after the fullness of the Gentiles come. So when you look in Matthew chapter 24, when he says in verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. You can see that as happening after the fullness of the Gentiles has come. He says in verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And that is completely consistent with Matthew 13 that we went over when he was talking about the parables of the kingdom. When the disciples asked, when will these things take place? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? If you go back to Matthew chapter 13, that phrase, end of the age, pops up at least twice. Once in connection to the parable of the tares. At the end of the age, he says, remember that parable where he says he's going to allow the tares to grow up with the wheat? And then at the end of the age, the angels would be sent forth, and they would basically harvest all of that, and then the tares would be separated from the wheat. And then he also uses that with the parable of the dragnet. The great dragnet cast into the sea, bringing in all different types of fish. But then at the end of the age, it would be designated which fish were acceptable and which ones were not. A picture of the day of judgment. Here, this same idea is being brought out by Jesus. He's going to send out his angels at the end of the age. He's sending out his angels to gather up his elect, to gather up the wheat, to gather up the good fish, to take into his barn, as it was used in the parable of the tares, or to be brought into his eternal abode. And so this is the picture that's being painted for us here in Matthew 24. In verse 32, he says, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door." So just as you know, when you see this fig tree, when it's becoming tender and the leaves are coming out, you know that summer's coming. That's a sign that summer's coming. But he says, when you see all these things taking place, know that these things are about to take place. In verse, and that they're right at the door. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So again, here's this phrase, this generation. In chapter 23 and verse 36, he said, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." And then in verse 34 of chapter 24, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So these are events that were going to begin within that generation. And there are things that were going to take place start at that starting point with the destruction of Jerusalem. That was a sign that things are coming to a head. The Lord is drawing near, and it was going to continue on through the tribulation until the end time when the great gathering takes place. The harvest time comes. So he's given us some indicators of what's going to happen. But then in verse 36 he says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." When the end comes, no one knows that. And there's been a lot of people who say it's going to happen on this date, and it's going to happen on that date, and time again, they've been proven false. Don't listen to anyone who tells you, "I know the exact day the Lord's coming," when the end is coming. We don't know the exact hour or day. We have these signs that tell us, it could happen at any moment, these indicators, but we just don't know exactly when it's going to happen. He says in verse 37, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left." The idea here is that you don't know when it's going to happen, but when it happens, it's going to happen quickly. And it's going to be like the flood in Noah's day. Hundreds of years pass by, all the while Noah's building that ark, telling people that judgment is coming. And then came the flood. And those who didn't believe the message got swept away. 2 Peter chapter 3 relates this to the destruction of the world, when he says that in the end people would be mocking. In verse 3 of 2 Peter 3, "Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation.'" And people can say that today, right? 2,000 years have passed. We've been saying, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. Where is the promise of his coming? Everything seems to be continuing on as it did from the beginning. But he says in verse 5, "But for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded by water. But by his word the present heaven and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance." And so there Peter painting the picture of a lengthy amount of time taking place before the end. And people would begin to speculate and think, okay, well, been saying he's coming, he's not coming, but destruction will come. And he uses Noah flood to talk about that, just as Jesus did here. And the idea here is that, too, that it's going to happen very quickly. So 2 people are going to be at the mill, 2 people are going to be in the field, and it's going to happen, and the state in which they are in will determine where they go. And some will be taken, and some will be left. But it's coming suddenly. So the idea here is that you need to be prepared, and that brings us to the next section. And we're running out of time. So, and we're actually at a good stopping place, because in verse 42, we're going to see, well, what does this all mean? I mean, is this all just theological things that we just can muse about and talk about and have a good conversation around the dinner table with? Or does it have some type of practical value to us? And next week, Lord willing, we will look at what the practical value to all these things that Jesus was teaching really is. So in closing, I would just like to say one thing that Jesus wanted to bring across. You know, I talked about, we covered a lot of controversial things over this, and I just kind of did kind of a grazing of all these things. There's a lot of things, and I'd encourage each of you to study this for yourself and come to your own conclusions. And you might disagree with me once you reach those conclusions, or maybe you've already reached conclusions that you disagree with me on. But let's stand together on this. The main point here is, let's hold fast to Christ. Whatever's coming, whatever the plan is, whenever the end happens, whatever he's going to do with the Jewish nation, whatever all this is, let's cling to Christ. Let's not cling to another. Let's not be misled. And the second thing is, let's escape from the destruction to come. Those were his two concerns. Don't follow false messiahs, and get out of the city before destruction. And that's what our encouragement is. Cling to Christ and escape the judgment to come. Don't let it come to you unexpectedly, to where you will be cast aside with those who undergo the great judgment that is coming. So if you're here this morning and you want to cling to Christ, you want to escape the judgment to come, and we'll probably talk about more next week, but if you want to escape the judgment that's coming, the time when the Lord will come again, when the earth and the elements will melt with fervent heat, when he will create the new heavens and the new earth, and you want to be a participant of the eternal things that God has for you, not to be a participant in eternal destruction, we would encourage you to place your faith in Christ, come to him, and if you want to make that known now, please come forward as we stand and sing this song that JT has prepared.